I'm Peter Adamson, and you're listening to the History of Philosophy podcast, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Probable, Pierre Bayle and his Dictionary. Publishers love reference works and books for the general reader because they sell so many more copies than, say, scholarly monographs. Hence the proliferation of guides and companions in the history of philosophy. To quote a joke I saw online, it can't be long before we see the appearance of an Oxford Handbook to Oxford Handbooks. And it gets worse. These days, even podcast series on the history of philosophy appear as printed volumes, available apparently at all good bookshops and making a great choice for any gift-giving occasion, or so they say. But there's at least one good thing that one can say about this development. It does have a long pedigree. The first great example of the genre already came at the turn of the 18th century, Pierre Bayle's Historical and Critical Dictionary. He was, of course, put up to it by his publisher. The idea was to cash in on the popularity of another historical dictionary by Louis Moreri by putting out a tome that would correct its mistakes. Bayle circulated a pre-publication version to colleagues including Leibniz, who complained about all the complaining. Rather than itemizing errors, Bayle should focus on conveying truths. Taking the point, Bayle expanded the project into something far more ambitious. First edition in 2 volumes would appear in 1696, followed by further editions in 1702 and 1720. That final version was posthumous. Bayle already died in 1706, but it's the most complete expression of his vision, containing no fewer than 2,035 entries spread across 4 volumes. That's a big number, but it probably doesn't convey the full scope of this monumental piece of scholarship. When I say entry, you're probably imagining something along the lines of a short paragraph, which isn't entirely misleading, because each entry does indeed include a brief main text that supplies the reader with basic information about the topic, which is usually a historical person. But that's only the beginning. Each main entry has below it remarks printed in smaller typeface, and there are further brief bits of information in the margins. You'll perhaps know Alfred North Whitehead's famous remark that the history of philosophy consists of footnotes to Plato. Well, Bayle's dictionary is history and philosophy in the form of footnotes, with much of the intellectual action happening in the various remarks. To make things yet more complex, Bayle made free use of cross-references between articles, sending sufficiently determined readers through a maze-like process of comparisons and contextualizations, which often raise questions about his intent as an author. As Bayle expert Mara van der Lugt puts it, the resulting work is easy to browse, challenging to read, and difficult to study. It was also difficult to take, at least for some contemporaries. They were appalled by several features of the work, ranging from its presentation of scandalous and titillating material to a penchant for religious skepticism that seemed to border on outright unbelief. The central interpretive question for us in approaching the dictionary is whether these critics were right. Not about the obscenities, though don't worry, I'll get to those shortly, but about the degree of Bayle's skepticism. Still today, some see him as a profoundly skeptical and perhaps even atheistic author. Others believe that he followed in the footsteps of earlier Christian skeptics who exposed the limitations of reason to make room for faith. Bayle comments on the issue in the third of 4 clarifications that he added to the dictionary. And characteristically, these clarifications leave much unclear. It's been said that they should have been called obscurifications instead. No more definitive is a 1692 essay by Bayle explaining the project he was then working on. Here too, he anticipates and answers possible criticisms, including the worry that a critical dictionary might make him enemies. An entirely justified worry, but one he casually waves away with the promise to be as fair and polite as possible when identifying the mistakes of other authors. Here, Bayle is voicing his allegiance to the values of the Republic of Letters, which of course had already been a fixture on the European intellectual scene for decades by this point. Bayle contributed greatly to this international community by founding and editing the Journal of the Republic of Letters, as I mentioned back in episode 463. He believed deeply in the Republic's values of dispassionate research and collegiality across confessional divides. Bayle himself was a Huguenot, though he briefly converted to Catholicism in his early 20s. After returning to the Protestant fold, He taught at the Huguenot Academy at Sedan, but fled to Rotterdam in the Netherlands after the king dissolved the academy in 1681. In exile, he would learn of the revocation of the Edict of Tolerance for Protestants in France, and the death of his own brother in a French prison, both of which came in 1685. This annus horribilis gave Bayle strong personal reasons to despise religious intolerance. As we'll see next time, he had strong philosophical reasons too. Another hypothetical objection considered in his essay introducing the dictionary project, in fact, has to do with religion. Much of the material he would be including, goes the complaint, would serve no purpose and be of merely antiquarian interest. To this, Bayle replies that we would, if we were purely rational, concern ourselves solely with salvation in the afterlife. But we're not purely rational, so Bayle is happy to cater to what he calls a taste long established for delving into the details of history for its own sake. It was no doubt in this spirit of giving the public what they wanted that he unhesitatingly included scandalous narratives in his dictionary. Among them is the infamous story about the ancient Cynic couple, Crites and Hipparchia, unashamedly enjoying sex in public. Bayle not only mentions this in his main entry on Hipparchia, but includes a lengthy and learned remark on the tale. He says that there is no convincing argument to show that people shouldn't have sex in public. The only really good reason not to do so is religious prohibition. Bayle is taking the opportunity to allude to the central theme of his dictionary. Human reason is so weak that it often needs faith to settle questions it cannot handle. Isn't it a good idea, he says, to recount the outrageous sins of the pagans, the better to humiliate and mortify our reason and convince us of the infinite corruption of the human heart? By this logic, censorious readers should in fact applaud the inclusion of this salacious material. Here in the article on Hipparchia, and again in the clarification devoted to the inclusion of such squalid material in the dictionary, Bayle offers a second justification, one that is in some tension with this supposedly pious defense. His project is a historical one, and as a historian his job is simply to report the facts without concealment or euphemism. Not that avoiding frank speech does any good anyway. Everyone knows what is meant by a phrase like, "the parts that shall remain nameless," and there's nothing wrong with calling those parts to mind. If there were, it would never be acceptable to make people think about sex or the sexual organs, so we shouldn't even mention marriage or childbirth in public. Weddings and baptisms would not be holy events celebrated in churches, but dark and secret affairs best kept out of view. This is all good fun for the modern-day reader, and Bayle is clearly having fun too, discussing obscenities at great length by way of apologizing for mentioning them in the first place. As for his claim to be a sober historian, this is rather undermined by his use of an anecdote about another cynic, Diogenes. Supposedly, he too had sex in public, and when challenged to explain what in the world he was doing, said, "I'm planting a man." Having worked this entertaining one-liner into his defense of mentioning obscenities on the grounds of historical accuracy, Bayle then admits that it's probably not true anyway. By now we're used to this sort of game-playing, which goes back through the history of humanism. Erasmus, the patron saint of humanist irony, gets high marks in the dictionary because he was so firmly on the side of erudition and tolerance, which are perhaps the two things Bayle values most highly. And that brings us to the serious side of his discussion of obscenity. Bayle thinks one should be open to discuss any topic and consider fairly any idea. If one does that, one will find that even the most outrageous philosophical and religious proposals are terribly difficult to refute. This makes it hard to know what to think, which seems to be the chief effect intended by the dictionary. Hipparchia the Cynic is only one of several ancient philosophical figures who appear as a representative for skepticism. Bayle's article on the pre-Socratic Xenophanes emphasizes that for this early thinker, all things were incomprehensible, before going on to assimilate his teachings to those of Spinoza, who was at this time at least as scandalous as having sex in public. Also pressed into the service of a modern philosophical debate is Zeno of Elea, whom we covered about 15 years and exactly 490 episodes ago. But I'm guessing you'll remember him nonetheless. He was the follower of Parmenides, who used a series of paradoxes to show that motion is impossible. The point of this was to show that being is one and unchanging. Bayle suggests a different possible consequence, though. As long as a dispute is going on about whether we know or do not know the nature of substance and of matter, this will be an indication that we do not understand anything. Writing in the wake of Cartesian physics, Bayle takes Zeno's paradoxes to undermine the very idea of extension, which would leave the rest of the new philosophical system in tatters. Descartes' physics comes up even more explicitly in the article on Pyrrho, the founding figure of ancient skepticism, and thus a thinker of great interest to Bayle. In a sequence we should already be finding familiar, Bayle first reassures us that hardly anyone falls for the tricks of the skeptics, before going on to show that skeptical arguments are genuinely daunting, if not unassailable. Descartes' physics has, after all, shown that such apparently fundamental features of the world as heat and color are just modes of the soul, so that bodies are not at all as they appear. In this sense, Pyrrho and the other ancient skeptics were well ahead of their time. Worse still, Descartes was overconfident in assuming that God never deceives us. After all, if God makes us think things are colored when they're not, what other errors might he be leading us into? Nor can we take refuge in ethical certainties. The Christian doctrine of original sin proves that, against all our moral intuitions, it's fine to punish people for things they didn't do. Meanwhile, the miracle of the Eucharist shows that our beliefs about physical substances are totally unreliable. When the many pieces of bread used at masses across the world transform into Christ's body, that body manages to be in many places at the same time. And once we take account of divine omnipotence, we can't even rule out that our souls have been destroyed and recreated so that we're not even the same people we were this morning. In short, human reason is entirely unreliable. If we want certainty, then we must enslave our understanding to the obeisance of faith, as Bayle puts it. He favorably cites the skeptic Moth Leverrier, who observed that skepticism is the philosophical approach best matched to religion. Whether you're a skeptic or not, you'll be in little doubt that this would have infuriated some of Bayle's readers. After all, this was a time when scholastics at the universities were still confidently asserting that Christian theology can be built upon the foundations of Aristotelian science, while the scholastics' leading opponents, the Cartesians, were no less confident that skepticism could be defeated so as to pave the way for rational belief in such dogmas as God's existence and the immortality of the soul. In sharp contrast to such confident rationalism, Bayle says outright that Christian beliefs are often absurd from the perspective of natural reason. This obviously raises the possibility that he has deep misgivings about those beliefs and may be inviting the reader to share those misgivings. Alternatively, we might emphasize Bayle's religious allegiances. Remember, he's a Huguenot, so it would make perfect sense for him to share the Calvinist attitude that reason is radically limited and that faith does often require us to accept things that seem almost literally unbelievable. Bayle addresses these issues in his third clarification, which responds to criticism of the skeptical tendencies in the dictionary. His stance is that of a modern-day teenager, sorry, not sorry. Instead of retreating from the conclusions of his articles on Zeno and Pyrrho, he reminds his readers of the skeptical modes presented by Sextus Empiricus, which purport to show that no proposition can be rationally justified. A controversial proposition cannot just be assumed without argument, it needs to be proven. But any further proposition used to prove it will also need proof, yielding either a regress or a circle. Tellingly, Bayle makes no attempt to resolve this impasse. Perhaps even more tellingly, he reiterates that rational argument is especially ineffective in religious contexts. Conjuring the amusing image of scholastics trying to convert the peoples of the Americas with their pedantic and technical arguments, he dismissively says that their public disputations change nobody. Everyone departs from them with the same opinions he arrived with. In particular, we cannot use reason to settle the disputes between different groups within Christianity. This leads him to the following remarkable statement, which is worth quoting in full. If you are willing to believe the incomprehensible mysteries of religion, choose Christianity and leave philosophy. For to have together self-evidence and incomprehensibility is something that cannot be. The combination of these two items is hardly more impossible than the combination of the properties of a square and a circle. A choice must necessarily be made. If the advantages of a round table do not satisfy you, have a square one made, and do not pretend that the same table could furnish you with the advantages of both a round table and a square one. Here we come back to the uncertainty surrounding Bayle's uncertainty. On the face of it, he seems to be using skepticism to make room for faith. This would be like an epistemological version of what the Quietists did in the realm of practical philosophy. Just as they counseled silencing the human will to leave room for nothing but God's will, Bayle would be silencing human reason in order to let the voice of religious conviction ring out loud and clear. Well, as Bayle himself might say, maybe. But there's an ongoing scholarly controversy about both the extent and intent of Bayle's skepticism and whether it is meant to cast doubt on faith as well as reason. Let's start with what seems relatively uncontroversial, namely that Bayle is at the very least separating reason and religion as two domains of belief. In religion, we cannot rely on rational support, so we must simply resolve to believe without justification. Here, one might think back to the Jansenists, and especially to Pascal, whose famous wager encourages us to believe in precisely this way. And, as we saw with Pascal, this is not necessarily so easy to do. For Bayle, most Christians only believe that they believe, and supposedly he reached for a similar turn of phrase on his deathbed, remarking in his dying moments that Christianity is probably probable. In philosophy, by contrast, we have to give reasons for our convictions, ideally, reasons that rise to the level of ironclad proof. Sadly, these reasons are often inadequate, perhaps even always inadequate. This doesn't mean that Bayle suspends judgment across the board. His job as a historian involves sifting through the records and coming to conclusions that are worth presenting and that he thinks he can justify. In his clarification about discussing historical obscenities, he describes his task as follows: "It is necessary to bring to bear proofs, to examine them, confirm them, and clarify them." But for Bayle, this sort of task is unfeasible when it comes to the deeper mysteries of faith. He rejects the pretensions of Christian philosophers who think they can build their faith upon reason and use rational argument to dispel religious disagreements. As will be seen, this is an important point for his views on tolerance. Such disagreements are wholly intractable, and it's absurd to persecute other people for believing things that you yourself cannot show to be false. Bayle also puts the point in Cartesian terms. Our religious beliefs are never going to rise to the level of clear and distinct ideas, and we cannot follow all the rules laid down by Descartes before adopting religious beliefs. In other words, religious doctrines cannot survive the method of radical doubt. This wouldn't be so worrying if it only concerned abstruse mysteries of Christianity like the Trinity and the Incarnation, but as Bayle frequently points out, religion tends to undermine our confidence in other areas too. I already mentioned his observation that the doctrine of original sin makes a mockery of our moral assumptions. Similarly, as Bayle points out, the Bible praises figures who seem at best ethically dubious, like King David. And if you do believe in the mystery of the Trinity, what happens to arithmetic? Bayle's evident penchant for irony and misdirection encourages some to take a different lesson from all this, namely that religion deserves our skepticism at least as much as the deliverance of reason do. Jonathan Israel has written that Bayle's protestations of faith are a smokescreen that serves no real function in Bayle's philosophy other than categorically to separate philosophy from theology and deflect criticism by concealing the true implications of his stance. If this is right, then Bayle was a truly radical thinker, one who may have been just barely concealing anti-religious, perhaps even atheistic sentiments, the sharpest of needles hidden amongst the vast haystack of learning that is his dictionary. The labyrinthine experience of reading it may itself be meant to induce deep and abiding doubt. Bayle calmly presents many arguments that tend towards alarming conclusions that would be unacceptable to even the most liberal of Bayle's contemporaries. Instead of offering the reprieve of a refutation, Bayle often just refers them to another part of the dictionary, where they will find more such arguments. The dictionary is a mighty edifice, but as you explore it, you may well find the ground giving way beneath you. Whatever Bayle's inmost convictions, this very ambiguity about religious belief surely gives him an illustrious place in the history of religious critique, even of atheism. As we'll be seeing in the next episode, that history takes a big leap forward just around this time, in works that were still more daring than Bayle's dictionary. I know that some listeners out there have sometimes gotten frustrated with all the religiously motivated philosophy that we've covered here on the podcast. If that applies to you, and if you've been waiting impatiently for philosophers courageous enough to reject religion outright, even to deny the existence of God, then your wait is almost over. Only almost, because we're about to go on our annual summer break. But come September, it won't be only the leaves that start to fall. Alongside Bayle, the staggeringly skeptical Jean Meslier will seek to bring religion crashing down to earth. Here on The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps.